You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Daniel Arthur Smith.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories Podcast today. You can find links to all of the shows at hankgarner.com. There's a handy sidebar with links where you can subscribe to the show any way that you like to listen to podcasts. There's a link there. It's hankgarner.com. There's more than 500 shows. Dig in and find something that you would enjoy. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today before we get started. Author Mary Buckham has a 3-book set. She's a USA Today bestseller, The Invisible Recruits, The Beginning, a 3-book set. Kindle edition is on sale now for $2.99. That's 3 books for $2.99. Join new IR agents Alec Nozick and Kelly McAllister as they struggle to master their newfound preternatural abilities while being thrown into a dark world of danger and intrigue. Being an invisible recruit means learn hard lessons fast or die trying. Hidden from a world unaware of magic, Alex and Kelly are members of a group of operatives known as the Invisible Recruits, the only ones willing to stand between mankind and those powerful preternatural factions, seeking to change the balance of power and gain world domination. While battling for their lives, Alex and Kelly both must deal with dangerous creatures, mysterious pasts, shape-shifting brothers, and more. What could possibly go wrong? Begin with the novella that started it all, Invisible Prison, to discover how Alex Nozick first met the IR team. Then join Alex on her initial solo mission in Invisible Magic. Next, it's time to join teammate Kelly McAllister in a race to uncover secrets and stop evil growing in the heart of Africa. Mary writes stories full of grit and determination with plenty of action, but always with a sense of hope and a good dollop of romance. Get the 3-book set for only $2.99, Invisible Recruits, The Beginning, a 3-book set for Kindle. Also, I'd like to thank George Kramer. His new book, To Some It's Just a Rose, is out now. Nancy Hemingway is a beautiful, wealthy heiress that has a penchant for attracting weirdos. When roses start mysteriously appearing at her doorstep, at work, and everywhere she turns, her friends begin disappearing. Nancy enlists her eccentric cousin Etna to help her figure out what's going on, only to discover that Etna isn't who she thought she was. Nothing is as it appears to be, and someone is targeting Nancy. Can she outsmart this lunatic and find her friends before it's too late? The new psychological thriller from George Kramer, To Some It's Just a Rose. Thank you to J.R. Hanley and Chris Winder. Their new book, Breach Team, is out now. Survival means fighting through the unknown. Corporal John Harden is a decorated soldier living in the shadow of his father, a celebrated war hero. Determined to make his own way in the galaxy, John develops a reputation as a brawler, serving aboard the USS Hughes. A rescue beacon brings John and his fellow legionnaires to a cargo ship thought lost 2 decades ago, and the heavily damaged alien vessel of an unknown species that took it down. With the brass demanding details and apparent survivors begging for aid, John's team boards the derelict ships, vowing to leave no man behind. On board, nightmares become reality as John and his team are separated and left behind, presumed to be killed in action. Assaulted on all sides by mysterious alien tech, John gets the chance to finally prove himself worth being his father's son, if he can survive the onslaught. The way home is inside, and John won't back down from the fight, though a determined enemy will make him pay for every inch. Breach Team is a non-stop action thrill ride with fast-paced warfare written by 2 veterans. Join the fight by getting your copy today. Breach Team by J.R. Hanley and Chris Winder. Thanks for listening. Now on to our interview. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, my guest is one of my favorite storytellers. Daniel Arthur Smith has been a great friend of mine and a great friend of the show since all the way back to the very beginning. Daniel was one of our first guests in that first year of podcasting. And we've been doing this series of shows where we focus on a topic of the creative process and of storytelling. And I wanted to do a show all about short story writing. And Daniel is one of my favorite novelists, but he is absolutely one of the best short story authors that I know. So much so that he, has curated a couple of fantastic anthologies, Clones and Oceans, excuse me for the cough there, and but also puts out this monthly magazine, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. We're up to episode number 29, or issue 29, and we've talked about canyons before, where Daniel has really brought back that love of the early pulp magazine, where so many of us got inspiration to become the writers that we are. And Daniel is proudly carrying that flag and the torch of the pulp short story. Welcome back to the show, Daniel.
Hey there, Hank. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming. So short stories. What is your, what's your memory of one of your favorite short stories that was influential for you or inspirational to you, that really lit a creative fire in you?
Well, for short stories, if I go back to high school, and everybody read Shirley Jackson, and everybody read The Lottery, and the idea that you believe one thing is happening and then something else is happening really caught my attention. And then at the same time, there was a short story, I believe it was Stephen Crane, and this isn't at my fingertips. What was it? Incident on a Bridge? Owl Bridge.
So I remember that.
Yeah. So the idea is we have a Civil War soldier who's about to be hung, and the rope breaks, and he makes his getaway, and then it's an awesome story. But then this is the first time that we realize we're in a dream sequence, because at the end he actually never escaped, and shame on me for not remembering the title correctly. I thought it was there, but those stories were stories that made me really question what could you do with the short form. Where could you explore? Back to Shirley Jackson, she tells a story in The Lottery of a young housewife, and we think it's possibly the Midwest or the Plain States, and a community that's a community of faith. And we have an annual harvest ritual, celebration, festival, and we don't at all expect to happen what ends up happening. And it definitely pushes your perception of how things aren't exactly what you believe them to be, because if you just base it on your experiences, you're going to be very limited. And even now, looking back at that story with things I know today, is what happened in that story isn't much different than what happens in some parts of the world in reality still today. And I'm not a spoiler alert for a 70-year-old story, but there's a stoning near the end of the story, right? Right. And so back farther than that, though, I would say those were the first very intellectual short stories that really pushed me. But back before that, of course, it's Poe. Poe is, I think, a lot of us when we first go to the trough, we read Poe, we read Mark Twain, and maybe we're brought in because there's a thrill involved in the story that in just a few paragraphs or a few pages, something that's easier to take in when you're younger. You're brought into a whole world, and you actually have a physical excitement within those few paragraphs or pages. Mark Twain's case, oftentimes it was humor, and you're laughing quite out loud in very short order. And with Poe, depending on the story, it's eeriness, or if you're young, it could be terror.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the idea of misdirection, or the idea that stories could be what you as the reader don't expect. And that seems to kind of be a hallmark of short story writing. And I hadn't really thought that deeply about it. But some of my my favorite short stories are that way, where the writer, deftly sets up a scenario where I believe it's one thing, and then, the rug gets pulled out from under me in some way or another toward the end. And if done correctly, can be a very powerful tool that, and we've all seen it done where it's just a gotcha, and, you can a lot of times see that stuff coming. Do you think there's something inherent with the short story medium that allows for that type of storytelling that maybe novel writing doesn't, where that sort of misdirection doesn't work as well in a longer work as it might in sub 10,000 words?
All right, well, let's break that apart. So first, let's think about what the short story is. And when we go back to word of mouth tradition, poetry, the Greek myths, I mean, those are straight up stories that usually have a very defined plots and a very defined moral. With fables, we have the alligator and the fox crossing the river, the fox and the grapes. All these stories are definitely meant to tell a direct lesson. But now, fast forward to contemporary fiction. Fortunately, people are, I say this tongue in cheek, but literacy is far higher today than it was when we had word of mouth storytelling. And add to that, short stories are frequently told in the television medium, whether it be in a sitcom or an anthology series like Black Mirror is one of my favorites. But there are so many, Twilight Zone. And so what ends up happening now is if we want to just put a plot straight forward, the old formula used to be you need to introduce the characters, you need to have a conflict, and then you need to have a climax and a resolution. And that's fine, but it just becomes, they say you can't write anything new. And I think that's where we jump to the contemporary, that now we're seeing it's like, okay, I have that plot, but everybody's going to expect this to happen, or everybody's seen this before, or the guy's going to get the girl this way, and if he doesn't get the girl, it's going to go that way. And so that's where we need to have the secondary, not conflict necessarily, but the twist, the turn. Now, as far as whether it's done well or not, I would say part of that is craft. We look back, I mentioned Shirley Jackson already. There's nary a word wasted. She's written so tight. Every line is leading you further down that step of deception. And it's one of those stories that then you go back and read. It's like, well, didn't I have a clue? And you're like, well, actually, she gave me some clues, but I didn't. I let them be something else. So, shame on me. But then, so in that way, it's craft. But then I think sometimes we get lucky. As Ray Bradbury said, if you write a story every week, you're bound to have a good one.
Right.
Yep. And so I want to give credit on either side of that. One of the having the Canyons of the Damned and the Frontiers of Speculative Fiction, one of the huge benefits of that is I'm exposed to a lot of stories, a lot of fiction coming from different levels of skill, different levels of storytelling. I have submissions sometimes that, it's a very clean document, very perfect document, very predictable document, but the story just doesn't do anything for you. And then I've also received submissions where it was sloppy misspelling. I mean, I would dare say not near professional, but the story was so intriguing or so fresh that I've reached out to those authors and offered to help them out to kind of clean up the submission process a little bit. And so in both cases, it shows you, some say there's a difference between maybe a writer and a storyteller. I'm not sure if that's true, but I do think with short fiction, there definitely is something that uniquely that we're looking for. It evolves, but it stays consistent over a period of time.
Well, what I like to think is that storytellers are born, and then if you want to pursue the craft of writing, then you can work on that. I don't know, like you can teach a storyteller how to write better. I don't know that you can teach someone that's not a natural storyteller how to engage someone. I don't know. I would love to see someone.
Well, you nailed it on the head. I mean, we're fortunate enough that we've received submissions from PhDs, from men and women who are teaching literary fiction on the university level, and again, their their submissions are pristine in appearance. They use some real fancy language sometimes, but there's just no story there. It's just a lot of times it doesn't even paint a picture. Where other times, because when we have our reading window open, we're open to everybody, and I'll get stories from people that they'll say, "Hey, this is my first submission or my second submission," and within 3 paragraphs, very subtly, I'm taken deep into a world. And I'm like, this must be somebody writing under a pseudonym. This guy's pulling my chain, I mean, it's just that, I'm not going to name names or point at people, but I mean, it really, you really get some great things. And so I think you're exactly correct that you can teach finesse and practice and punctuation and grammar. But a good story, wow, that's, that has to come from a storyteller.
Well, we find ourselves using language that's really, kind of out there when you start talking about stories. Sometimes it's just magic. Sometimes it's ethereal. The stories come from somewhere else. The characters are alive and we're just reporting on what they're doing. It's really a lot of weirdness when you start breaking it down. And we just accept that as acceptable, that we can just talk that way about story, and the people that are wired that way get it. And I think the people that aren't, kind of shake their head and walk the other direction, maybe. I don't know. Story is still, after 535 episodes of this show, story is still just elusive and weird and magic to me. And it makes me want to do it even more because of the magic.
Well, I mean, story is enigmatic in and of itself. I've been a big fan of Joseph Campbell forever. And so I think there is something to the intrinsic story that's within us, that we search for. I think in every story, we are looking for a hero, a protagonist. Again, what's evolved in short fiction and long fiction is what we define as the hero has changed radically. Now there's dark heroes, if you will, and that of course some readers are like, well, hey, I can't get behind a drug dealer, I mean, regardless of his turmoil or the circumstance, where other people are just captivated of how someone becomes a drug dealer, so so I think what's great is there's story for everybody on the surface. When we get down to the details of whether or not we say it's a romance or it takes place on a tropical island or if it's on a spaceship or on a sea ship. But I think the stories themselves remain the same. They're a matter of human condition, right?
Yeah.
And at that level, I think it's, something you can do probably better in long fiction, is just have kind of like nonstop action to get through a story arc. That is a bit more of a challenge in a short story, to have a short story move really fast without jumping into some meta fiction, where you're not even really reading a linear narrative, right? So, I'm a fan of those too. I think everybody is a fan of different things. So some people are going to like the action, or they're going to like the space, or they're going to like the pew pew space opera. But then other people are fine with 100 pages of people sitting in a room having a discussion. But to bring it back to short story, I think that the challenge is there always is it's hard to boil down that 100 pages and have the same effect, or 25 pages. Boil it down to 5 pages. I mean, the shorter your fiction is, the more poignant it needs to be.
Right. And more pointed.
And more pointed. Yes. Thanks. Yeah.
Speaking of Ray Bradbury, and he's one of my writing heroes, and I love that, that story he tells about, if you want to be a writer, sit down and write a short story every week, and write it in 2 or 3 days, use a couple of days to edit, and then move on to the next one the next week, and at the end of the year you can't write 52 bad ones. That's I like that. I think there's no better way to learn to write stories than to write stories, and to read good stories, and to go out and interact with people and understand how dialogue works and how human interaction is. Would you give that advice to someone who wants to get into writing? Would you tell them to write until they get better, or is there some other practical advice other than keep doing it until it comes?
Well, I always believe that you just keep writing it. I mean, the first one, but the way to get there is like, well, keep writing what? I think when we think about a novel, that's the thing of, one of my professors used to say, don't eat the whole pie, just eat a piece at a time. You'll get there. And so I think that's the case. One of the thrilling things about being a resident of New York City is I can walk out of my house and everybody I look at has a story. And that in itself, whether or not I commit that story to paper, and then sometimes I do, but my mind, sometimes I have to willfully push it to say, hey, who is that guy? What is that guy? What's going on? Is that a secret agent or is that a homeless person? But you do it enough and you start to have a discipline. And then, of course, there's those characters that will just jump right out, where you're like, oh, well, that guy's a pirate, and so, or this woman, she's she's just broke up with her second husband, and she's on the lam because he's searching for her, and she's French, she's from Paris. These are the things that if you just can practice the shortest of short stories, just the imagery that's right in front of your face, write down what you see. Now, some people say, well, then keep a journal does that. Well, I'm not saying keep a journal or a diary. I think that's fine if you do. I have friends that do that. I always find that admirable. I have friends that blog the same way, and they document what they did today or the high point of the day. But that isn't necessarily going to get you to learning how to compose short fiction. Short fiction needs, you just need to ask yourself, who is this character? What are they doing here? Where did they come from? Where are they going? Everybody has a story. And the great thing about being a fiction writer, this isn't, I'm not talking about short nonfiction. You don't have to really try to figure out really, it's a fiction. It's more fun. Just make it up for them, Right.
Do you approach, short fiction differently than you approach long fiction? Like for me, for instance, if I'm working on a novel, I'll usually have a character or two, and I get an idea of a situation that they're in, and then out of that comes setting, and then I start looking at their longer journey, and maybe I'll envision a few stops along the way. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that, because I have a whole new theory, and it goes back to Ray Bradbury.
I've got to hear this.
Right. So a professor of mine way back, actually, he had been my teacher in middle school, and then when I went to junior college, it just so happened that his career had moved on to junior college, and then so had mine. So and I used to spend a lot of time in his office, and he at one point in time had wanted to be a novelist, and then for the whole other side story, he backed off. But the advice he had given me is that before you write a novel, write some poetry, because that'll work on your imagery, right?
Sure.
And then write short stories, because what are short stories, or what's a novel, but a collection of short stories going to a greater point. So that was his perspective on that.
I like that, actually. That's a good way of looking at that.
So we bring it back to Bradbury. He actually only wrote, and again, I don't have my scholar hat on, but I'm going to say one or two full, long novels that were, from scratch, if you will. And I don't know if he outlined them or pantsed them, but what I was saying, as opposed to his other novels, like The Martian Chronicles, those were fix-ups.
Yeah, and just a collection of vignettes, really.
Right. So a fix-up is a term that you don't hear that often because it's a craft term. And so a fix-up is where you take a group of short stories that are maybe already loosely connected, and then you go in, maybe you make some of the characters more consistent, or you put them in the same town. So you actually do a little bit of editing so that they pull together. But then when you get done, you have a novel, like The Martian Chronicles, and that's what that is. And then a few of his novels, the Illustrated Man was a fix-up, of course, but we almost think of that one as a short story collection, but it's not. It's a linear story that's held together by the Illustrated Man. The pictures are being told from the tattoos of somebody, right? And so bringing it to him, this is something that I've been practicing for, I want to say, going on 3 years now. So I do write at least one short story a month. My schedule doesn't allow me to write one a week like Mr. Bradbury. But for the most part, they're written within the same worlds, okay? And so the reason why I do that is because when I've written novels in the past, going way, 10 years ago, just pantsing out, even with an outline, I found that I was, my scenes were weaker, and they really were just working on one. I was just stretching out these bigger scenes, okay, and so now what I do is I write a lot of short stories. So I really know the world really well when I jump to a novel. So the Spectral Shift was my last full-length novel to publish. So I've written a ton in the spectral worlds, as I like to call them. And so now that I'm working on the next book in this series, I have been for a while actually, but it's very developed. I mean, even though I don't have to put all the facts and exposition up front to say this, it's like I know why they do things, how they do things. I've learned about the characters. I've learned about the culture. And the second thing that's allowed me to do with short fiction is I have enough short stories now within these different worlds, like Spectral Worlds, for example, that if I wanted to put together a fix-up novel, I possibly could, right? So that really goes from a way of, what else happens in this world. And I think we see a lot of authors doing that when they go back and, they'll write a novel and then they'll go back and write a short story to support that novel. Or to say, well, whatever happened to that character that was, people always love that B character that was only in a chapter or two, but it's a lot of fun to go back and say, well, what happened to that? Or how did they get that way? Or, whatever the case may be.
I love the idea of connected short stories and building a world that you just get these glimpses into. And then the overarching narrative that ties it all together. I really like the idea of the fix-up novel and the idea of that. I feel like the market is not as interested in a grand scale of stories like that quite so much, but I think that's where some really fantastic storytelling comes from.
Well, I know that. Yeah. So if you step away from craft and you're talking about market,
right? Yeah.
Could you pitch a fix-up novel? I think you'd have a real tough time unless you're J.K. Rowling, sure. and you said, well, yeah, I have all these stories of all these other characters from Hogwarts, and I put it, they wouldn't even blink. They wouldn't blink. But if you were going in with a new novel, to do like what Ray Bradbury had done, to say, hey, I have this, and I think a couple of times he did it to meet publishing deadlines.
Probably, yeah.
I believe I read that somewhere, and somebody listening to the show can check me on that. But I believe that was the catalyst for a couple of these. Is they said, well, hey, you have a 2-book contract or a 3-book contract, and he's like, oh, well, here you go. And I want to say I think that may have been tied directly to what Martian Chronicles had been. But as we know, it was like one of his best-selling books, novels. I certainly don't think you could market it as such. But again, that's more of a craft term. I think if you marketed it as the novel and as the narrative, I think you'd be fine. And I'll give you a quick example of that. There are several Stephen King novels that are composed of, and I'm not talking about short story collections, actual novels that are composed of several characters, each with their own little stories. The Dark Tower, a magnificent one, being one of those, right? So, we start with, the gun, was it the Dark Man fled across the desert, and the gunslinger
the Man in Black fled across.
Oh, the Man in Black. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just doing this off my memory here. So I'm sure every listener knows that line. It's a famous line that I messed it up. But that starts off. That's our first little story, and so there's several short stories within that one volume, and that volume is one of several volumes.
Yeah.
And so, arguably, I would say that, particularly with the first books that he composed over years and years and years, I think he threw together ideas and brought in ideas. I think arguably there are chunks of that are fix-up.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's certainly not marketed as that. It's certainly not marketed as short stories linked together. And I think that's because times have changed. I think one of the reasons why Ray Bradbury is marketed as such is he came from the golden age of science fiction when short stories were what people were looking for, wanted to see. And at that time, in the American culture, we didn't have the smartphones, we didn't have television. It was about picking something up and reading something that you could read in a short amount of time and put it down. And, a lot of people leaned to that rather than leaning to novels. So it was actually a selling point, in the 50s, early 60s.
Well, and I wanted to say something about the market. Just because something is not popular in the market at the moment, I don't think people should be discouraged from pursuing that if it's something that they love, because as we've seen time and time again, things are rules in the industry until they're not, until someone comes along and does something that kind of takes everybody by surprise, and then we have this whole new revolution, So just because something is not popular at the moment, that should not discourage you from doing something that you feel passionate about.
Well, it shouldn't discourage you. And again, if it's not something that's being accepted at the moment, you just don't have to focus on that aspect of the work. For example, our friend Hugh Hawley, he's been on your show a bunch of times. He wrote a few novels. Great. He wrote a short story. It took off. It was a short story.
Yeah. Yes.
Wool, how many novels is it like 9 altogether or something or 3 or I mean it depends on how you break them up, I guess, right?
Right. Well, and then he's got the follow-ons that are all in the same world, and
yes, exactly. And I love him. I'm a big fan too. But that was a short story, and I think at the time, he marketed it as such when people were open to that. Oh, look, you can start with this idea. And then it evolves. And then I remember him, it might have even been on Author Stories, where he talked about all these other great novels that had started as short stories and then were expanded or extrapolated upon. Maybe today you wouldn't go in with that idea. I got a short story you wouldn't pitch. I want to turn it into a novel. Maybe you just say, hey, no, this is a novel about this. And I think that's kind of the best way to go. I mean, there's definitely something to be said for writing to market, but I think there are a lot of things that are written that apply to the current market. We as writers don't always know how to market them, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the problems, Daniel, is that it's not a problem. It's just the reality of where we are right now is that I completely understand writing to market. I think that's a smart thing to do for selling books right now. And I've had plenty of friends who write directly to market, and they're doing very well, and they're, building a career doing that. And I'm not discounting that at all. But I think maybe new people coming in that see people doing that, treat writing as, if I'm not successful right now, this minute, then I am a failure at what I'm doing. And although we do need to, if you want to be a writer and be a professional writer, you need to sell things, and that's just a reality of it. But we also need to focus on the fact that that this is a lifelong pursuit, and to have the long view. So maybe work on writing to market for some of your projects, but then have room for your passion projects that may not have a market right now, but they bring you satisfaction and they build you as a writer and they feed your creativity. I think there has to be room for both.
Well, if you want to have a successful career, yeah, you have to be able to do both.
Yeah.
But myself, I really don't have the bandwidth to do both. So what I've chosen to do is write the stories that align with my voice, and over the last decade, that's become more clear to me what that is, and it isn't necessarily genre specific.
Yeah.
I would like the Cycles to be able to write a few things to market, because it is fun to have a lot of readers when something's hot, But the big thing I want to point out, standing on your shoulders, is that if you do want the opportunity to have your voice heard, right? Your voice is Daniel Arthur Smith or Hank Garner or the next person coming out. It's important to work on the craft in a way that you care about and tell the stories that you care to tell, because readers will notice that. Readers will see that, and it might not happen overnight. Sometimes it takes a little while to get from reader to reader to the next reader, and then when it does happen, we're never even really sure how it just took off, right?
Right.
But the thing is, if you don't work on your voice, it's never going to happen. If you are, and I don't fault people for this at all. If you are a writer and your choice is just to write to market, and on top of that, let's say you're just writing to mimic something that you believe will sell, and it's not you. So arguably, one could say, well, that is your voice or not. But if it's not distinct and not unique, it'll sell today, and then when that market goes away, so will you. I mean, there are a handful of authors that we remember that were taught in school from 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20, 10. But the reality, it wasn't that there were just 10 authors in the 1940s or 1950s. There were hundreds. Back when there used to be bookstores were full of books. And many of those names, because they were writing to a market, those books were hot. They sold a lot for a month or two. And maybe those authors didn't get a chance to write anything again, or maybe they wrote a few more. But then, once that fad or that trend passes, they kind of fall away with the wind, except for maybe one or two of the standouts, And whereas if you have somebody that's writing something that they care about, I mean, you can pick any name of any of the top authors today, and you're going to say, well, and the thing about them is they're unique. You can pick up something without a name on it, and you're like, oh, I know who this is, right?
Exactly. When you tackle a new short story, and let's put aside the kind of shared universe that you sometimes write in, and where you have things established already, and maybe it's easier to get a story off the ground and started. If you're tackling a new, just a blank slate. Okay, I'm going to write a story. Maybe you've been commissioned, for someone else's anthology, and you're just coming in, blank. What's the first thing that comes to you, and how do you start envisioning the story? Do you plot short stories? Do you completely pants them? Do you look for some sort of imagery to begin with? How do you get the ball rolling?
All right, so very seldom do I have the whole story right when I sit down. That happens. It does happen. I think it happens to all of us once in a while. The muse will touch us with a wand, and
bam.
3 a.m.
It's always at 3 a.m.
Right. So that happens. That does happen. Most of the time, it does not happen like that. So most of the time, I'll sit down and I will have a story prompt. I mean, I have to say I've never suffered from writer's block. I've suffered from slow writing syndrome, but never from a block. So I'll sit down with a prompt, okay, and then I'll let that prompt develop. And I usually need more than a few days to stew on it because I'll probably write the first 500 words, and then that really kind of gets me thinking about what's happening, and and then I have to do my walk or my shower or whatever, over a period of time, and then when I come back, I'll say, yeah, you know what, but that 200 words is wrong because we really want to go left. We shouldn't be going right. So I'll give you an example of a story that I recently wrote. That's actually, it's in the latest Canyons, right? And so it's actually a follow-up story to one I wrote a year or two ago. And the one I wrote a year or two ago, some settlers are on a foreign world, right? And they're in synthetic bodies because their consciousness have been transferred into, when the planet is first established, it's established with robots, basically, but then their consciousness are pushed into some synthetic robots, machines, until the actual settler ship arrives. Okay, and in that first story, something happens to the settler ship that it's knocked out of its near light speed trajectory, and it's still going to be pretty fast because it's fiction. But instead of being a few years away, it's a few hundred years away, right? So, okay, fine. So I did that story, and there's a bit more to it, I think. So I decided that I wanted to revisit that world. And I thought when I sat down, I'm going to say, okay, so the one character has been awake now for 300 years, and what, now the settler ship's going to arrive. And I wrote 500 words. But then I was like, well, if they're living at a time when they're just sending settler ships out like that, wouldn't it really, they probably would have been able to get another fast ship going, or there probably would have been a second wave, or, there's no way they would have invested in a whole colony and then have something go wrong and just have them sit there for 300 years. So that ended up changing. So just in that thought that evolved, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there would have, his ship is still out there with his bio body, but the second wave is going to be here in 10 years, say 20 years. And so rather than having a village that he's just kind of maintaining for 300 years, which is a neat story in and of itself and was a neat idea, it became that now the entire planet's settled. So by the time his body and his family or whatever arrives, it's the whole planet's it's a future, it's filled with cities. So that didn't come all at once. That wasn't just a matter of typing a sentence of backspace. That probably took a week or two to really digest that and say what it means. And the reason why I mentioned that example is because I can't write something. It's the same thing as possibly writing to market. Right. I can't write something unless it's true to me.
Yes.
Unless it's true to me. I think it would have been a fine story if you would have said, no, Daniel, I kind of want to hear what happens if the guy's just stuck by himself for 300 years. And it's like, because I thought that would have been intriguing. But I'm like, yeah, but that's just ridiculous because, we got near light speed ships, which I see the irony of that. Well, that's not exactly the truth. But I had built a world where in my mind I decided that was possible, that they would have a plan B in place, right? And so by holding to my truth, that ended up changing the direction of the story and then ultimately changing the ending of the story.
Well, and as those readers start following these stories and they get invested in this world and in the laws that you've set into place, then staying true to your voice is more important because, like you said, it has to be true. It has to resonate with the reader. But you have to have integrity there, or your stories are not going to have the same impact.
Well, all right. So, and with that, so the other parts of truth, and I think this goes from author to author. But in your voice, you also develop certain rules, right? Like sure. There's words that I won't use. I won't use the word suddenly. Suddenly, I don't mind reading it. I mean, if somebody else writes it, I enjoy it, fine. But I can't do that. I cannot start a story with dialogue. I don't know why it bothers me so much for me to do that. I need to have the, like the line we quoted earlier that I misquoted from the Gunslinger. I mean, I like that kind of. I want to try. I'm attempting in every story to have that first line that sets the scene, that draws the reader in. And now, I'm not saying dialogue can't do it. I probably could do it with dialogue. For some reason, though, there's an OCD mental block that won't let me do that. So there's that kind of truth, right? And to compensate for that, I have a series of short stories that are based entirely on dialogue, and they're called The Lost Tapes, where it's kind of like an X-Files interview where an agent is interviewing a subject. And the reason why I do those stories is I'm forcing myself, again, in the short fiction form, to tell an entire story in a conversation, have the whole world be built, without having to step away and say, they're in this cold room. I'd rather have the character say it's cold in here. But I actually had to create that exercise of a dialogue-based framework to kind of get over my OCD of not having dialogue at the beginning.
I love that
story.
Well, one of the challenges of that is when you switch from first person to third person or third person to first person. There are a lot of things when you have an omniscient narrator that you can get across to the reader pretty easily. You can set the stage, you can set a mood, you can all of this before your characters enter the stage, so to speak. But when you're in first person, you have to tell the reader all that, or if you have a dialogue based, story, then you've got to communicate all of that stuff, and that becomes an extra challenge. Do you typically write in first or third when you're writing short stories, or does it matter?
Well, it does
matter.
It does matter. It does matter to me. I think it's easier for me to write in first person and to tell a story. I think readers would probably enjoy my work a lot better if I just stuck to that, because I think that's a natural voice for me. I push myself to, one of the reasons why I write a short story every month is I'm pushing myself to try new things and new techniques. The goal ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, is I want to bring that to other forms of fiction, long fiction. I want to try to see if I can carry the mood of a race car driver without limbs that plugs into a velocity racer, I think is what I call a Veloxity. I think is what I call the Veloxity racer. And so that was a short story. And I think I had enough there that I could go back and turn that into a novel. Then there's other short stories where I've written them and said, well, that's all that's been told. I do think that some of them to the reader may be better than others, because I don't know that I always achieve the success I'm looking for when I take on these challenges the first time. So, so with that, I think it's important to do these studies. I mean, that's what it is. If I was a landscape artist, landscape artists often chalk out a scene or watercolor. They'll create the outline of the landscape before they commit to oils.
Right.
And so this is a different kind of outlining than what you usually talk about of, do you outline or pants? This is the kind of outline of like, what if I tried to do this technique? Now, on the very high level, you said it's like first person versus third person, right? But what if it's first person, but it's unreliable narrator? How can I make this person unreliable? How can I be consistent? But how can I, not give it all away to the reader? I mean, it always looks easy when you see someone do it.
Right.
You're like, oh yeah, but I encourage every writer listening. It's if you haven't already, write a short story with an unreliable narrator. And see how well you do the first time around. It's rough.
Well, and see how difficult it is to be consistently unreliable. That is, that's a kind of a funny play on words, but it's that's a great exercise for getting into that character's head.
That's right, and that's how you learn about the character. I mean, because it's in some of these short stories. I mean, I think the challenges are important. So I mentioned the challenge of writing in dialogue. I've written in first person. I've written in third person. I actually did write in second person, and
that's tough.
That was tough. That was really tough. For our friend Chris Porteau, I submitted a story for the second Tales book. And so I wrote from the perspective of an animal. And man, wow, that was really challenging. I mean, I would have to say that was one of the hardest stories I ever had to write, and Chris really pulled me through that. Although, if you ask him, he might say that I was, dragged me maybe, and I wasn't, I wasn't totally on board with it. I was very tough on it because I was having a hard time with it,
Yeah.
So I know I wasn't he edited he didn't just curate, he actually edited those stories, and I'm sure I was a pain in the neck.
Oh, he's a tough editor too.
He's a great editor. He's a great. I'm really glad to call him friend. He's a skilled guy. But in that, I certainly wasn't fun to play with in the sandbox, and I know I wasn't. And I went back and read it, and I'm like, oh, I should have went with some of his suggestions. And I'm sure he's like, yes, that's correct. That's actually correct. You should have gone with my suggestions. But there's another story that I worked with Jessica West with, and this story was actually done as a prompt from another author, Pavarti Tyler, P.K. Tyler. And there was a summer that she was giving me prompts for short stories. So other than using my own prompts. And so the idea was to have a space dinosaur. And so we did that. But I did a couple things that made that story interesting. One, I had to figure out how to have a dinosaur according to my truth of how would there be a dinosaur in space and Mars. So it's colonial, it's farmed, it's genetics. Okay. And it's not really a dinosaur. It's a ornithominid, which is kind of like an ostrich dinosaur. Sure. It's a dinosaur, but it isn't like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so once we solved that, the challenge is I wrote the whole story from the perspective of an 8-year-old girl. And so, I mean, I would compare it by no means of skill or brilliance but when you read, the character Scout, in
Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, man, why am I just having this day? Kill a Mockingbird.
I do exactly what you were going for.
Yeah, the first 100 pages, as you remember, before we even get to the trial, are just Scout talking about, you're learning about what it's like for her to go about town and what's happening with her and all. So I don't know that when I wrote it, I was really thinking directly of her, but going back, having read To Kill a Mockingbird recently and then seeing the Aaron Sorkin play recently, I definitely know where at least in my subconscious, where I was aiming. But if that wasn't enough of a challenge, so we had to have a space dinosaur. I wrote from the perspective of an 8-year-old girl, but then I decided, again to my truth, that colony on Mars, like all colonies, even on our planet initially, had different dialects. You speak a little bit differently than I do because your ancestors settled in the southern colonies and mine settled in the northern colonies, right?
Right.
And the British colonies in the Africa and the Gold Coast, they have a patois it's basically almost pigged in, like its own different language, as is like Creole. And so I decided, well, that's probably how this small town farm would be, that they would have their own language. And so the first couple drafts I wrote, I actually phonetically spelled out the words. So there was no distinct T sound, which is similar to the Gold Coast language, right? And so so instead of saying what, it said wa. So it's like this very Irvine Welsh. If you ever read Trainspotting, he does this chapter to chapter. So if you kind of know what the accent is and you read it, instead of saying of, it's going to be OAF, oaf. So I did that. Well, then what ended up happening, I think I successfully transcribed into that language. I had my own idioms. I was happy about that. And then I gave it to P.K. Tyler because she had given me the prompt. And she said, I don't understand this at all. I said, oh. So what happened is I went too far.
Right.
So then working with Jessica West, our editor, this is how it became a Jessica West project, is then we went through and we kind of watered it down and we shifted it from the Gulf Coast, or Gold Coast, I'm sorry, to the Gulf Coast. And Jessica West, she's lives in Louisiana, and in the southern type part of, she's out there somewhere.
Yeah, she's my neighbor.
Yes, essentially, right. And so she went through and helped me to make it a bit more readable. But what we actually ended up with is that project then evolved into, so this is the challenges of a short story. That project then basically evolved into an audiobook. So when you get the short story, if you purchase it, basically what it says is this is the script to the audiobook narrated by Jessica West. So then she was able to, because her natural voice, which is like music to my ears, is in this patois. Wow. So this is, so again, I don't know what readers think of that so much. I've had some good response. I think others are like, wow, that's just experimental and way out there, good for you. And others just don't, really want to touch it. But I think as a writer, to bring it all the way back around, I think it's important to try these things, to learn about these things, and find out what works and what doesn't. And it doesn't always work. That's the thing.
Well, and sometimes it works, but on a level that we don't quite understand, kind of like a Plastic Ono band record, in the 70s that nobody really appreciated. And then, you can go back now and go, I get it now. I was not ready for that yet, but I get it now. And the stories are like that sometimes. Sometimes it's just not the time for it, or, I don't know, but, it's never a bad idea to experiment with something and push your own boundaries.
It isn't just that it may not be right for it, but again, if this is your path, if you're looking at short fiction, if you're looking to create short fiction as a way to accentuate your craft, either as a short fiction writer or just as a fiction writer all the way around, you have to be willing to walk out on that wire. You have to be willing to take those chances. You have to be willing to, do the Plastic Ono band thing. And this is always going to be a case where if you succeed, well, everybody's going to call you a genius. And if it doesn't succeed, you're not gonna move many copies. The readers won't get past the first page. But that's not to say that you don't learn something there that you use later on. So I recently listened to that audiobook with Jessica West just this past weekend. And while listening to it with my wife, I heard parts of that story that I'd forgotten about. I wrote this a couple years ago. And I realized that there are huge parts of that story that, in the development and understanding it, when learning about this colony, that have become truth to my writing and my world. Right? So actually there's probably more, even though the patois doesn't survive and writing as an 8-year-old girl may or may not come back in another story, what I learned about that world and what I learned about perception of that world persists in my other writing.
Love it. There's, tools in your toolbox, arrows in your quiver, whatever terminology you want. The writing experience constantly gives us those things, and those are things that you only get from trying new things and for working the craft.
Well, I know we have to wrap up soon, but I want to just kind of make sure I get this out there.
Yeah.
I will go so far with these challenges that I think we've spoke about this before in the early Author Stories podcast, but I'm a firm believer that in the definition of creativity, that creativity is done within a framework, right? So a picture has a frame, your life has a frame, a beginning and an end. Most everything has a parameter, and it's almost like an E equals MC squared situation, that the tighter you make those parameters, the more creativity needs to be pushed out to fulfill what goes in there. So this is why even with the Canyons, we have months where we'll pick a theme, and I encourage the writers, and you yourself have been a conspirator with the Canyons, and the reason why I put these themes in is I know that writers that frequently contribute to the Canyons, I know what they're capable of. So I want to push them. I want to say, okay, well, I know you can write about this. I know you write a great ghost story, or I know you write a great thriller, or I know you write something that we think about. But no, how about this time it has to be blah 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 blah. And I always very rewarded in seeing what writers come up with when they're given those parameters, and it's never the same thing. It's like the old MIT experience. Well, it's probably still going on, where they're given like some ping pong balls and a box full of rubber bands and some tools, and they're told to go off and create a machine that moves the ping pong balls, and they all come back with a different machine, right?
Right.
Right.
So exciting. So exciting. I love, like I said earlier, the more we talk about it, the more we see exciting stuff coming out from our friends and from people that we respect. It's crazy. The more excited that I get, it's telling stories and seeing people that bring stories alive just never gets old to me. I just love it so much. Dan, if folks are not familiar with Canyons of the Damned, God forbid, we're going to put a link to that in the show notes. But what if people want to learn more about you and dig into your back catalog? I know we have a lot of new and different listeners from the last time you were on the show. Where can people connect with you and find out about all that you do? And how can they submit a story for Tales?
Well, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned has a website called canyonsofthedamned.com, and we can put that in the show notes. Currently, the reading window's closed. I'm still about 100 stories behind for 2019. But just please keep checking back, because that reading window will open up again. And we don't. The only limitations we have on submissions is word count. We accept stories from 500 words to 5,000, and currently we are not accepting reprints due to the Amazon terms of service. But we may in the future. We used to, and we had to change that, and we may again. This has nothing to do with a bias on our part. It has to do with the terms of service.
Right.
With Amazon. And then for my own work, please drop by DanielArthurSmith.com. All the books are available across all of the surviving booksellers, and everything is available on Amazon, where people can find also print editions, and for some editions, audiobooks.
Excellent. Daniel, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. It's a pleasure as always. You're one of my favorite writers and oldest friends in the writing business, and I appreciate every time we get to hang out together.
Oh, me too, Hank. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. You can find archives of all of the shows at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please subscribe. Up next is an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
On Walpurgis night, when the moon is high, hell's bells ring and witches must answer. They dapple their breasts with rendered fat of murdered babes, straddle their brooms and take to the sky, as the devil wills, to speed through dreamy midnight air to the summit of the Brockenberg, that haunted peak shrouded in swirling mists, where a glen of gnarled limbs and wan moonlight awaits to host their debauches and blasphemies. Now to the Brocken the witches ride. The stubble is gold and the corn is green. There shall the carnival sabbat be seen, and the devil shall come to preside. The accuser elopes from the bowels of hell, a sure-footed, goat-headed, many-horned beast with cloven hooves and a staff of bone. He perches upon the witch altar to brood in cerulean half-light, a winged silhouette with watchful red eyes. The witches gather and bow to their master, upon his charred rump give the shameful kiss, then imps beat the drum and a round dance begins. Lash yourselves into frenzy, hags, pass the chalice of pure marrow broth. Whip the ground with your hair, tread the sky with your feet, dance with joined hands around Satan's cold fire. Then find out a nook of nettles and moss, and lay with the rough-skinned beast of your choosing, suckling some rancid teat of desire. But hist! The cock crows. Away, away! Gather your tatters and broomsticks and wits, back to your huts, to your thresholds and hearths, and become once more, at the red break of day, the furtive adder in your neighbor's garden. The ghost host of the Salem Sorcery Tour, dazzling in his steampunk Victorian morning crepe, let the spell he'd woven trail through the twilight air like a hag across the moon, then chirped, "Isn't that silly?" and bowed, sweeping the wet grass with his satin-ribboned top hat. The tour group gave a polite round of applause. Nobody believes that stuff today, but the Puritans sure did. They took witches very seriously. If they went down in the morning and bought eggs, and one was rotten, surely the devil had come in the night, gone boop, tee-hee-hee, then scampered off on his little hooves. And who's in league with the devil? Witches. We're taught that the Puritans were super nice and cute with little buckles on their hats, but it's not the case, folks. They were fanatics. Witch hunts don't happen in a healthy society. They hated kids. They hated women. They were crazy. And that craziness. He turned on the spot, casting a protective circle around the stone garden of the witch memorial. Got these people killed